A few months ago, I did two videos back to back that were reviewing every single banned Xyz monster in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, and in today's video, we're finally doing the long-awaited sequel, which is going to be reviewing every single banned Synchro monster. There's a few things that I want to mention. First off, I mentioned in the last video that it's kind of difficult to track this information down. If you want to hear more about that, feel free to watch that past video that's titled Dear Konami, Please Fix This, but the gist is that there's not a ton of great ways, not a ton of officially great ways that you can actually look at the older ban lists. The European site posts a lot of them, but if you want to track how long one card was on the ban list, it's pretty tough and it's pretty time consuming as well, because you have to go back and individually look at every single ban list and see how long this card was banned. It also doesn't tell you if the card got errataed, which a lot of these cards did, which is pretty interesting as we look through these 6 cards that have been banned in the TCG. Keep in mind, unlike the Xyz monsters, almost all of these are actually off the ban list. In the case of the Xyz monsters, all of them except for one of them were still banned, but in the case of these Synchro monsters, many of them have new effects that make them less broken, or they just got power crept as time went on. Also keep in mind that I'm only focusing on these cards in relation to the TCG ban list, not the OCG ban list. I will talk about a few instances in relation to the OCG ban list, but mostly I'm just going to be focusing on the TCG because I don't play in the OCG and I don't really know the full extent of that particular format. It took a little while for a Synchro monster to be banned, and the very first one in the TCG was Dark Strike Fighter, which was banned September 2009 after just being legal for one singular format. I've talked about for a while why this card was so powerful. The basic play that you did was Summoner Monk into Rescue Cat into 2 tuner monsters. You could then summon 2 Dark Strike Fighters, attack your opponent directly with both, and then in main phase 2 tribute both Dark Strike Fighters with their own effects to do exactly 8,000 damage. That type of combo was absolutely insane for 2009 Yu-Gi-Oh! And it really led this card to being the first banned Synchro monster. Prior to this, we saw tons of fantastically powerful Synchro monsters, but nothing quite as degenerate as that Summoner Monk combo into double Dark Strike Fighter. You might notice though that this card isn't on the ban list anymore. In 2014 for OCG players, this card was unbanned, and in 2015 for TCG players, this card was unbanned. However, the reason is not because this card was power crept. No, Konami actually changed the effect in 2 pretty significant ways that made this card a lot less powerful. First off, you can now only use the effect in main phase 1. That completely makes that original combo that I talked about irrelevant because you can't attack with this card and then tribute it in main phase 2. But more importantly, this card is now a hard once per turn effect, which means no matter how many copies you can summon, you can only use 1 copy per turn, and that means that you really can't do 8,000 damage by just summoning a Dark Strike Fighter. Certainly there are still some combos you could do with this card, but in general this card has seen no play after its effect got changed, therefore it doesn't really need to be on the ban list. It took 2 years later for a new Synchro monster to be banned, and in March of 2011, Goyo Guardian, an insanely powerful level 6 generic Synchro monster, finally was forbidden. This card was the bane of many players' existences, especially considering how much attack points this thing had for a level 6 Synchro monster. 2800 means that this card can run over several level 7 and level 8 Synchro monsters and steal them to put them on your side of the field. That was absolutely ridiculous, especially during a time when there wasn't nearly as much effect negation running around, and Goyo Guardian truly was one of the best, if not the best, level 6 Synchro monsters in the game as far as that year, that format of Yu-Gi-Oh! It didn't stay banned for too long though, just 3 years, because in the TCG of July 2014, this card did go to limited and the prices skyrocketed. Keep in mind, at that time, the game has changed quite a bit. Synchro monsters aren't all over the place, and this thing doesn't really get that much value from stealing Xyz monsters because they don't come back with material. Probably more importantly though, by this time we have a lot more effect negation, things like Breakthrough Skill and Fiendish Chain, but also we see a lot of cards like Dimensional Prison running around and Fire and Ice Hand, which blow up your entire board. Goyo Guardian by comparison isn't nearly as impactful. It actually has to live until the battle phase, when in a lot of cases you would just get hit by Artifact Moraltalk. However, it's worth mentioning that the funny story about Goyo Guardian, at least in the TCG, is that this card didn't really do anything for a while. Even when it was limited and then went to semi-limited then unlimited, it didn't really make a huge impact, but because the OCG still had this card banned, one of the things that they felt the card needed to come back to their format was change its requirements to summon. permanent and that you now have to use an Earth tuner. This made the card completely terrible, but for the OSG players it made sense because to them the card was banned, and then to unban it, like many of the other Duelist Saga cards that we got back, which I've made an entire video about, they figured that they had to change the effect or the requirements in some way to bring it back to their game. But by that point we had already had Goyo Guardian for about 3 years and it hadn't made a huge impact, so suddenly these new changes, which did have to get updated in the TCG, made this card go from maybe being playable in a few rogue decks to completely unplayable in pretty much every single deck out there. Exactly 1 year later, in March of 2012, we had Trishal Ax Dragon of the Ice Barrier banned, and for a good reason. To many players this was one of, if not the best synchro monsters in the entire game for a long time. The sheer value that you can get from summoning Trishal Ax by banishing a card on the field, hand, and graveyard is just absolutely off the charts, even by nowadays standards. I mean, if you look back to 2015 when Necros were out there, one of the biggest reasons that Necros were so powerful was Necros of Trishal Ax, and that one required you to banish a card from each spot. One of the ways that you could play around Necros of Trishal Ax was by not having a card on the field or not having a card in the hand, but the original Trishal Ax doesn't care about that stuff. They're all optional. You don't have to banish from every single place, and that means that this card was absolutely unstoppable. I mean, if you didn't have an effect negation, you were losing a lot of cards. I don't have the exact date that this card got unbanned in the OCG, but I know that it was a lot sooner than for the TCG. The TCG players had to wait until July of 2015 to get Trishal Ax back, and it's always stayed limited since then. I think when you put this card to anything more than limited, it gets a little bit crazy because this thing is not a hard once return effect. If you have multiple copies and you can summon multiple copies, you can use their effects multiple times in one turn. That's pretty crazy, even by 2019 standards, especially if you consider if we would have had 3 Trishal Ax back when Firewall Dragon was legal, there probably would have been some infinite loops where you banish all the cards in your opponent's hand, field, and graveyard. That would have been too good, so this card has stayed limited, and it has seen some fringe play. It saw success in dinosaur strategies back when they had Miscellaneous Source at 3. I guess right now they have Miscellaneous Source at 3. Back when it first came out, a lot of people played Trishal Ax in those dinosaur deck lists, but also it's just seen fringe play in pretty much any deck that can make a level 9 synchro monster. Level 9 synchros aren't too good, but Trishal Ax in particular is very powerful, and if you can resolve its effect against a lot of matchups, that just wins you the game instantly. Obviously the card isn't really in favor these days, but it still has seen some on and off play throughout the years since it's been back at limited, and it's a really cool card to have in the game just in case a new synchro deck comes out that can take advantage of its effect. What's funny is that just a few months later, in September of 2012, we had yet another Dragon of the Ice Barrier banned. Breanna is a level 6 synchro monster that can bounce your own cards, it can bounce your opponent's cards, while also setting your graveyard up for future combos, and this card was played in almost every single deck that can make a level 6 synchro monster. Keep in mind that when this card came out, Goyo Guardian was still banned, and there weren't a ton of great generic level 6 synchro monsters. Certain archetypes had better level 6 synchro monsters than other archetypes, but in general, you didn't really have something super strong like Goyo Guardian until Breanna came out and sort of wrecked the meta. This thing was used in so many crazy combos. It wasn't quite the Firewall Dragon, but in a lot of ways it was similar because it was bouncing your own cards back to your hand to reuse them on later turns, or even during that own turn because there weren't really that many hard ones per turn effects back in the day. This thing was banned much longer than Trishal Ax, all the way up until March 2017 when Duelist Saga came out, which is the same set that Goyo Guardian received its new text. In the same way, Breanna got nerfed in a lot of ways, although it has seen some play. The main nerf here is that you can only use the effect once per turn, and you have to do all of your discards right away, and oh yeah, you can't bounce your own cards, so no crazy loops are available anymore. Still, this thing was a pretty key part of the Jesse Cotton YCS Sydney decklist that he got second place with, able to bounce all of your opponent's Thunder Dragon cards back to their hand, because this thing is still pretty effective at dealing with monsters summoned from the extra deck. It doesn't really matter if they're Synchros or Xyz or Link monsters, they all go back to the extra deck, and that's a ton of value if you can manage to summon this thing pretty easily. The fact of the matter is though is that most decks these days can't really summon this card that easily, so it's not being played nearly as much as it was back in the day. Maybe if this card didn't have its errata, it'd probably be played in some degenerate combo deck, but as it stands right now, it's pretty much just a cool tech option if you can make a level 6 Synchro monster for breaking your opponent's board going second. And then in September of 2017, we had the first Synchro monster ban for a couple years, and that was Dinglong, First of the Yang Zing. This is a card that I played a lot, and I played Dinosaur Dinosaur Yang Zings back when the Dinosaur Structure deck came out and Dragonic Diagram was new, and I loved that deck so much. This thing has 3 crazy effects. It searches a card, it's a floater, it can change its level by sending a card to the graveyard. This card did everything you could possibly ask for. It made Solidine Oviraptor a 1-card double negation combo, which is absolutely bonkers for that Dinosaur Yang Zing deck. I love that deck so much, and also Yang Zing Dinosaurs won the World Championship. There's sort of this rumor going around that if a deck wins Worlds, it has to get hit on the next ban list, and in some cases that is true. Some decks get absolutely murdered on the next ban list, like Dinosaur Yang Zings. I think that it's worth talking about, maybe in a future video, that not every deck that wins Worlds gets hit directly. If you look back at Satellar Knights, like they took a hit to Rhoda, but no other cards, and Trickstars took a hit to like Hornet Drones and Terraforming and no other cards. No Trickstar cards were hit, no Satellar Knight cards were hit, but in the case of Dinosaur Yang Zings, they lost a lot. They lost Dinglong and they lost Lithosagem on the same ban list, but Dinglong was way too good as a 1-of in that deck. Even as a 2-of, sometimes people would play it, but it's still really powerful because it just does too much for 1 card. This is a case where if this card could only use 1 of these effects per turn, or even just 2 of these effects in a turn, it'd probably be balanced enough to come back to the game, but as it stands, you just shouldn't have this much utility out of 1 card. This card actually gets even better with Link Summoning because you can float into greater Link monsters, and that's absolutely ridiculous. I don't know if this card will ever come back. It probably is okay to come back in a few years once it gets power crept, but as of right now, especially with Miscellaneousaurus back at 3 copies per deck, and dinosaur cards are actually even better than they were back in the day because now we have double evolution pill, this thing probably should stay banned for a little while, which hurts me to say because I love this card so much. And then in May of 2018, we had the final Synchro monster ban, and it's been a year now and we haven't seen any new ones on the Forbidden and Limited list. When Ancient Fairy Dragon was banned, I was very sad. I was using it casually in FAs, and I always get people asking me, well, when are you going to make a next FA update? And the answer is, I won't make an update until Ancient Fairy Dragon comes back because this card was way too critical for that deck's success, even though the deck wasn't that good. But anyway, why did Ancient Fairy Dragon get banned? Well, that is a pretty crazy question because this card wasn't really being played in a ton of strategies when it got banned. Sure, it was played in the past and it was especially good in decks like Spirals to cycle through field spells, and it happened to be really good with Destrudo, a card that has gotten a lot of cards banned, and Destrudo probably someday will end up on the Forbidden Limited list, but at least for now, the fact of the matter is that Destrudo, it turns any card into a level 7 Synchro monster or more. We see it being used nowadays to summon things like Yazi of the Yang Zing, but Ancient Fairy Dragon was sort of like the first card that I noticed get hit because of Destrudo. Destrudo isn't necessarily overpowered, but does make summoning cards like Ancient Fairy Dragon a little bit easier, and while this card's field spell effect was very good, I think more so this card got banned because of the special summon from hand effect. Anytime that you can put extra summons on cards that aren't supposed to have extra summons, they tend to get hit on the ban list. Things like Brilliant Fusion, things like Nightmare Goblin, and things like Ancient Fairy Dragon all give you additional summons for cards that usually wouldn't have them, and they end up usually getting themselves banned or limited on the Forbidden Limited list. Still, I don't think it'd be too crazy to say that Ancient Fairy Dragon can probably come back. Maybe it'd be a little bit strong in some of the combo decks that are using field spells, but for the most part, I don't think this card is that imbalanced, especially compared to things like Dinglong, which definitely should stay banned, even though I like that card a lot. Ancient Fairy Dragon is a good card, and Destrudo is still a powerful card, but with things like Armageddonite Limited, getting to Destrudo on the first turn isn't as easy as it used to be, so Ancient Fairy Dragon isn't nearly as consistent as it was when it got banned. Regardless, if this video taught you anything, it's that it looks like Konami really does want these Synchro monsters back into the game. Of these 6 Synchro monsters that have been banned, 4 of them are currently legal, which means Konami is showing some signs of wanting these cards back in the game, whether or not that's waiting until they're power crept or changing their effects, and I think that's cool. Most of these cards, actually all of these cards in my opinion, are very iconic and have a place in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, so it's nice to have them back in the game even if they have slightly nerfed effects. None of these effects were totally overwritten, they didn't have crazy changes, like when you look at things like Crush Card Virus that are just completely different cards, but they still were made balanced in a few ways. I think if I can hope for anything in the future, it's that for something like Goyo Guardian to be reverted back to its original text. I don't think that will happen, but it'd be cool because then at least maybe it'd have some chance of seeing play in some strategies versus nowadays when basically no one's going to play it, because who's playing an Earth-based Synchro deck in 2019? Not a lot of people, and even if they were, would they even play Goyo Guardian? I'm not so sure. Anyway though, thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Sorry it took so long to get out there. You guys were very, very helpful at linking me to other websites where I could see the sort of the history of the ban list. And while none of them were perfect, a lot of them were good enough to help me make this video. So thank you so much to all of you guys that left comments on that last video where I talked about my struggles with looking at older ban lists. I'll see you later though. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.